So this is the picture of me and two other tank spotters just finishing the Tough Mudder. And my mother said that video games were bad for your health. What's up, everybody, and welcome to episode 7 of Aggathon's Rage Bar, the show where you ask me questions and I drink delicious beverages. Although I maybe need to change that little tagline, because again, I'm not going to answer any questions this week. Because, big news, I want you all to save them for next week, where Treckie from Method will be the guest host on the show. So please send us your questions, and we will be sure to answer them. So, as you can tell, I did the Tough Mudder. And if you're looking at the picture and going, the fuck, Ag, why are you so clean? Well, the very last obstacle, which is the one that the guy in the middle, Ion, got so dirty doing, is one called electroshock therapy. And I have epilepsy. So, voltage to the brain is bad. So the obstacle I did before that was basically jumping into water, so I was pretty clean towards the end. But believe me, I was very muddy at different points in that race. I barely made it though. I'm not in good enough shape to go 12 miles apparently. I barely made it. Ion and Tara did really well though. So congrats to them for finishing the Tough Mudder. I don't really feel like I deserve this headband, but I walked the whole 12 miles, damn it. So. Anyways, the drink of the week, I'm not actually going to drink because due to scheduling conflicts and flights and work and the Tough Mudder and all this other crazy stuff that's going on this weekend, I have very little time this week and I am about to drive to the airport, and drinking and driving is bad. Never drink and drive. But I will still give you a beer of the week. Especially for those of you in Denver or Colorado in general, since it's not being distributed in Colorado. But there is an awesome brewery that a friend of mine started. It is called the River North Brewery. And this is his Hello Darkness Black IPA. And this is a special version that is whiskey barrel aged. You guys, you have no idea how badly I want to drink this right now. But I won't. I promise, though, next time I do a show where I drink, maybe, you know what? I think maybe I'll see if Trekkie wants to do like a Swedish beer or something that you can get in Europe for the Euro fans out there, and then I'll drink this while he's drinking that. Other big news. Aggathon's Rage Bar has joined a network called blizzmasters. So there's a whole bunch of other shows kind of like mine out there that are talking about other, random aspects of the World of Warcraft. Talk about stuff like achievements and mounts with pets and stuff like that. It's a really cool site. It's a bunch of really good people. It's still very much getting together. It only started a few weeks ago. So I highly recommend that you guys go check them all out at blizzmasters.com and give them follows on Twitter and stuff. Of course, follow me on Twitter. That's at Aggathon. Or if you have any questions for the show next week, especially with Trekkie, you can send me a PM on TankSpot at the username Aggathon. So anyways, this week is going to be another one of those single topic weeks, and this week I want to ask you all, what makes a boss fight good? I think that there's a lot of aspects to design and counter design and how everything works, and there's a lot of people that go, oh, such and such was the worst instance ever, or such and such was such a great instance, or oh, this boss fight is terrible, I hate doing this boss fight. And So my question is, what makes that true? Like, what is a good boss fight? What is a good instance? And one of the things that I personally think that a lot of us at TankSpot have been talking about is that a good boss fight is something that is challenging. Now, what does that mean? How does making it challenging make it fun? I think there's a lot of different ways that you can make something challenging and fun. Um, One of them, so one of the mechanics that is almost always in the boss fight is don't stand in fire. It's not necessarily always fire. Sometimes it's a void zone. Sometimes it's acid on the ground. Sometimes it's a purple maze. But I think that the whole don't stand in this location mechanic is actually kind of a good thing, as long as it's done differently and it's varied. And uh, I think that can make things really interesting because boss positioning and other boss mechanics can change dramatically based on if there's something on the ground that you can't stand in. And I think the best example of that is Heroic Mimron, and it forces people to rethink how they're approaching a boss fight or dealing with specific mechanics. And on Heroic Mimron, uh, it was even better because you sort of had a say in a sense of where the fire was going to be on the ground, and you got to direct it. I think what makes a boss fight challenging is not something that's just a straight up tank and spank. That's just I equate a lot to actually how D&D kind of works. My favorite encounters in D&D has always been stuff where you have specific tools that you have to use in certain ways, and it's not just about I rolled a hit again. I hit him. Here's my damage roll. Okay, I did damage. Next person's turn. Like I really like fights that are more about using unique abilities and unique situations to get the boss fight down correctly. Another great example would be Twins in Sunwell, where you basically had a raid, stacking on a ledge, shooting down on these things, and it was because the positioning, worked out really well that way. As long as someone, whoever got the conflag would move out of the group. Um, sort of different weird positioning things or different tools that you would use. Another great example of using a tool in sort of a cool way would be, uh, you know, hand of protection. And on the Halfus fight, it was really a really cool thing for us. What we'd do is we'd have our one tank that was tanking Halfus and the other guys, and once he'd get too many stacks of the debuff, we'd just hop the debuffs off, or bop. Everyone still calls it bop. I'm not going to call it hop. Anyways, they would just bop him off, and he'd have this macro that would cancel the aura immediately, so the bosses wouldn't all run away and go kill someone else. It would just clear his debuff. And doing things like that I thought were really cool. Different ways that you can use your tools as a class or a character to get things done. Um, and to me, that's a lot better than the DPS Trek boss. Now, I do think that a lot of this sort of goes into, what makes a good raid boss versus what makes a good raid instance. And a lot of times I think that there are certain mechanics that you want to vary it per fight, because if every fight is the same, like, yeah, maybe it's challenging, but it's basically the same mechanics repeated over and over, you're going to hate that instance. And I think that things like a DPS check is really, really cool for the DPS that just want to, crank out the numbers and get better at their class. And I actually think that the DPS check bosses can help you with the other bosses that are more of like a, you got to deal with these mechanics, certainly. Because if you could do more DPS on those other fights, then it's easier to deal with those mechanics a lot of the time. But this sort of gets to a question of both group comp and what mechanics in a boss make it fun and challenging. So first, let's get to mechanics. So, and this, I really feel like this is sort of a personal opinion, but is so this is a question, I want feedback from you guys on this one. Are individual mechanics on a boss fight good, or are group mechanics good? Um, so things that you have to deal with as a group, with positioning and stuff like that. Um, so I'll give you an example of Galacross, for example, where everyone needs to be stacking up and everyone needs to make sure that they're absorbing the flame orb before it gets to them and moving up. If they don't have any stacks and stuff like that, is that working together as a group to make sure that all the stacks are good and that the healers aren't stressed beyond all belief. Another great group mechanics, actually like spoils a lot. It's largely a tank mechanic, but knowing when to open certain boxes and to deal with them, and you have two different groups that are basically doing the same thing but on opposite sides. Those two groups really have to work well in and of themselves to get things done. And I think those are really cool mechanics. Now, there are also individual mechanics, like I mentioned the conflag on Twin Imps, where it's one person has to make sure that they're doing this one thing, and you kind of hope that they don't get it because they might wipe the raid. Another really good example would be Terran Gorefiend back all the way in Blackwing Lair. Or not Blackwing Lair, sorry, Black Temple. And where an individual person would basically have to do this mini game, and if they screwed it up, they'd probably wipe the raid. Now, and really the one that's sticking out that I'm trying to avoid talking about, just because it was such a hard fight and it encompasses so much of this, but Heroic Ragnaros. Heroic Ragnaros was a really interesting fight because of all the different mechanics it encompassed. There were personal mechanics, like one person couldn't screw up. Everyone had to be standing in the exact right spot all the time. If one person screwed up, you were going to fail the DPS checks. You just couldn't have one person mess up constantly on that fight. And then in phase 4 on Heroic Rag, if one person wasn't perfectly positioned in that triangle, then it was a raid wipe. Or if one of the guys that was running around getting all of the absorbing all of the fire around the room, if one of those people made a strategic error and screwed up, there'd be all sorts of fire everywhere, then you'd wipe. And I think that fight was really, really good, and because it was very challenging. It had a whole lot of group mechanics that you had to deal with. It had a whole lot of personal mechanics that you had to deal with. But here's the question: was it a good boss fight, or was it too hard? Is there such a thing as a boss that is too hard? And I think that there is, and I think Heroic Ragnaros may have crossed that line a little bit, and 300 to 500 attempts on that boss. I mean, that just gets kind of boring after a while, doesn't it? Especially if you have the first like 3 phases of that fight all perfectly ironed out, and it's almost lulling yourself to sleep, just waiting to get to that last phase of the boss. It's like 10 minutes of, okay, yeah, we know this, we've got this, and then like bam, craziness. Oh, this is the part we have to try again. I also think though that in terms of what makes a boss fight good is it really has to be what makes an instance good also. And I think there has to be a lot of variations that you don't get bored just within a boss fight, but also within the tier. And one of the things I like to talk about is Tournament of the Grand Crusader. A lot of people quote that instance as the worst instance of all time, or the only other one was Dragon Soul, that people usually say, oh no, that was worse than Tournament of the Grand Crusader. And I think there's things that are a problem with both of those instances as to why they're generally considered the worst. Tournament of the Grand Crusader, individually, I really, really liked those boss fights. They were real fun. The problem was there's only 5 of them, there's no trash, and you're doing all of them 4 times a week on 4 different difficulties. Man, that'll burn you out quick. You're just gonna get bored seeing the same mechanics over and over again. It felt like at the time Blizzard felt like, well, if it's on a different difficulty, then it's like it's a different boss fight. So we don't really have 5 fights. We have 20 fights in this tier. Give me a break. Like that was brutal. But individually, I actually really enjoyed those fights. I thought Twins was a really well done fight, or the Twin Valks, that is. I thought that Heroic Noob 25 was an incredible fight. It was really challenging. It was one of those things where just everyone had to be on top of their game. One little slip up and it was a wipe. And being able to do something like getting, if any of you out there ever got um, the Grand Crusader title, kudos to you. That was real tough. Um, and the thing about Dragon Soul though was obviously it had a lot more bosses, but I felt like they weren't challenging, and there was a couple reasons why. First off, I felt like the biggest problem was the incremental nerfs. And you might say, well, it's only a 5% nerf. That's not that big. But it really was. And that's the problem, is that 5% can mean a huge difference on a boss fight. It can aggregate throughout a fight. So if you're 5% faster on this phase, then it helps a lot with the next phase that comes. Or you might not need a cooldown here to finish off this phase. And there's a whole lot of different things that 5% really matters. And the problem I think that a lot of people had was they would just go, especially when working on Heroic, I felt like a lot of people would just go, whatever, they'll probably nerf it this week. Let's just drop it to normal and just kill it regular. And that kind of mentality, kind of tells you a lot about the raid instance and how easy it is, and how much people just don't want to wipe on these bosses. They just don't care about them that much. And there were a couple fights in there that I felt like were really cool and really well done. I thought the Blackthorn was, I didn't personally like that fight, but I know a lot of people that did, and I can accept it because it was just kind of a different feel to a fight. Then I thought that Ultraxion was probably the best DPS check boss since, well, Patchwork. And I actually liked that fight a lot. It was pretty fun. Now I think that, and I also liked Yorsage, and to an extent, Zanaz. I thought those were really well done fights. Almost every other fight in that instance, I'd had enough of. Um, the two Deathwing fights were okay, but I feel like Spine, especially on Heroic, was another case of way overtuned, and then because I think there's something to be said for needing a different like mix of different classes per fight. Like I don't think every fight necessarily should be, well, we're gonna bring 6 healers and 17 DPS and 2 tanks to every fight. Or on 10 man, it's always going to be a 2 heal, 2 tank, blah blah blah. I think it's really okay to have that variation where you might drop a healer or add a healer or drop a tank to add a DPS, and I think those are really cool, and I actually think they add a lot of variety and spice to an instance that makes them better. But I don't think you should have to do class stacking to like the pre-nerf Spine did, where you were stacking, what was it, Subtlety Rogues or something, that had like the best burst DPS in the game. That was the only way you could get the Spines down. But then the problem was, like, by the time they nerfed everything, and then you got your 30% nerf, like, the fight was almost a joke. And I feel like there has to be this balance between challenging and ridiculous in order to make a fight really good and really fun. So anyways, that's my opinion on what makes a boss fight good, and what makes an instance good. So what do you guys think makes a boss fight good? What are some of your favorite bosses? I know I sort of asked that question earlier, but not just what were your favorite bosses, but why were they your favorites? Like, what was it, a certain mechanic that you liked dealing with? Was it, you liked the DPS check? Was it because the boss was so hard? Was it because the boss was easy? Let me know. Why did you like it? Send me your responses to @Aggathon on Twitter, or you could find me on TankSpot with the username Aggathon. And again, please send in those questions, especially since we will have Treckie from Method on the show next week. So, this this episode is going to be kind of short because I got to run to the airport. So, see you guys next week.